Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to create some elegant and simple birthday cards using the You're a Classic collection from Hero Arts. This is the You're a Classic Stampin' Cut set. Then we have the You're a Classic layering stencil set, and you can use that on its own, or you can use it with the stencil set or the stamp set to color in those images. And then lastly, there's the Classic Columns die set. I'm going to start off by using the Classic Columns die set, and I have these pieces die cut out of some specialty cardstock, some treasured cardstock from Spellbinders. So the top part of this column is die cut out of antique white treasured cardstock in the pearl finish. The base is die cut out of rose gold treasured cardstock in the pearl finish. And then my vase is die cut out of some aquamarine cardstock in the matte finish and some onyx cardstock in the brushed finish. So these cardstocks just add that little bit of elegance to them. You could use regular cardstock as well, but I do love the look of the treasured cardstock packs. I love the fact that there are 5 different finishes for each one of the colors. So there is 15 sheets total, 3 sheets of each different finish. So you have different choices to pick from there. The one thing you do need to be aware of though is because they have a non-porous finish on the top of them, they do take a little bit of extra time to dry. I like to dry or glue my die cuts with some Barely Art glue. I have it in a fine line bottle, so it works perfectly for small die cuts, but it does take just a little bit of extra time to dry because we don't have porous cardstock for that glue to absorb into. It's kind of on the surface. So for the first little bit, it's a little bit slick on there. And I do like to put it underneath an acrylic block to completely dry so that everything is nice and flat and lined up while it's drying. But I love the look of it, the look of those different finishes of cardstock. For the background for my first card, I'm using the Damask embossing folder. This is a 3D embossing folder that came out in the fall. I just think it's got a beautiful print to it. So I'm just using some Hammermill cardstock, using the 3D embossing folder, stacking on my die cutting machine, embossing it, and then I'm going to be trimming it down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. For a very simple card, I'm just using Raven cardstock for the mat for this. That is trimmed down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. You could also use that same Onyx cardstock that was used to die cut the pieces for the vase, but because we're seeing so little of it, I chose to just use black cardstock rather than cutting up or using up some of my treasured cardstock. Once I have that matte on there, we can put the embossed background on there. Now I chose to keep my embossed backgrounds for this video very, very simple. I just embossed them. I didn't add any ink to them. You certainly could if you wanted, but I chose to do it this way so that the focus is on the die cuts and on the stamped images rather than having anything in the background taking possible attention away. So when I'm gluing on top of embossed pieces of cardstock, I do like to be a little bit more generous with my glue because of that bumpy surface. I want to make sure that my die cut has some really good contact with that embossed surface. So I will make sure to be extra generous with my glue for that. Then I still put that acrylic block on top of there to make sure that it has good contact with the surfaces while it's drying. Now I haven't used my Stampin' Cut set yet, so I'm using a white eraser on the surface to remove any possible manufacturing residue. It just helps the stamps take ink a little bit better, and I do the entire set all at once so that I know if I've used one stamp from a set, I know it's been done. I don't need to do any more. I don't need to do it every single time. So I have a 1/4 sheet of Hammermill cardstock here that I'm just going to cover with stamps for the last 2 cards. I'm going to heat emboss my images with some rose gold embossing powder. This is just going to add a really elegant finish to it. You could do whatever color you're wanting. I chose the rose gold because I wanted something a little bit different from gold or silver, and I thought black was going to be too stark. This also coordinates with the rose gold cardstock that I used for the die cut for the first card. So I put all of my stamps on that sheet, making sure to fill it up. And I also am making sure that I leave some space between the different stamps so that I can fit the dies in there and die cut them nicely. I put a little bit of embossing powder tool on my cardstock, then ink my stamps with some VersaMark ink, stamping it a couple times to make sure that I have crisp, clean images and full images. Then I'm going to pour the rose gold embossing powder on top of that cardstock. Tap off any of the excess. If you happen to have grains of embossing powder where you don't want them to go, just use a soft brush to brush them away before melting it. Once I have that excess powder off of there, I can just put that excess powder right back into the jar. I love embossing because there's no waste to it. Then I can use my heat tool to melt that powder. And it goes from a rough granular look to a nice smooth glossy finish. And I think it's a perfect embossing powder for these statues just because it has a really elegant finish to them and the color isn't too stark. Statues tend to be fairly monotone, muted in tone, so I didn't want anything too distracting for them. So once I have these pieces embossed, I'm going to die cut them before I color them. Now, there are far too many pieces on this one sheet of paper to die cut them all at once. You want to make sure that there is space between your dies. You don't want them overlapping because you'll ruin your dies if they do overlap while you go through your machine. I'm also using some Best Ever Craft tape in order to tape those dies in place so that they're not going to move on me while I'm doing my die cutting. Once I have all of the dies on there that I'm going to use for the first pass, I put it through my die cutting machine and die cut those images, set them aside. Then I will tape all of the other dies and do that die cutting. I'll do that off screen because it's exactly the same as the first, just with different dies. Now I'll reuse those pieces of Best Ever Craft tape multiple times till they stop sticking. So you can get a lot of use out of that tape. I probably get about a half a dozen uses out of each one. So I do find it pretty economical. It goes a long way. So I added one of those sentiments to that first card that I created. Now I'm going to put those die cut images onto my sticky mat and I'm going to use the layering stencil to color those images in. You could also use, say, Copic markers, watercolors, or dye-based markers, however you like to color, but I like the look of that stencil. I thought it would make the coloring of these images really, really simple and nice and elegant. So the first color I'm using is Antique Linen. I'm trying to be very light or give a little very light coat to it. I don't want a lot of color on these little statues here, but I do want to have a hint of color. Now I chose to use Hammermill Cardstock for this, but you could use like Alabaster Cardstock that has a little bit of a cream tone to it first, and then you could even miss the first stencil and just go and do the second and third layer. So there is layers for the stands at the bottom as well. So I'm doing those as well. The second layer here I'm doing in tea dye, and I'm actually going to do the third layer in tea dye as well, but I'm going to be lighter handed or light coated with the second layer and then heavier handed with the third layer so that we have two different tones of the same color rather than introducing a third color to it. It's an easy way to do that. So once I have my statues colored, I'm going to be coloring in the little balloons in the cluster. And there's actually a solid stamp that you can use to color the balloons, so it makes it super, super easy. There's also a little balloon animal in that stamp set that you could use for creating a very simple birthday card, as well as a single balloon and a string for a single balloon and a little ice cream cone. So you can put little props with these statues as well, just to give them just some fun whimsy. So the stencils are really easy to line up. I found the secret to the figure stencils. I lined up the toes and then I lined up the top of the head, and I found that by doing the two of them, you kind of got the rest of it lined up, obviously. Once I have my figures done, I can go and color in the balloons using that solid stamp. So I'm using some Squeezed Lemonade, Picked Raspberry, and Broken China Distress ink. This would also be a fun area to use interference inks for a little bit of extra shimmer. And I also think using watercolor cardstock and watercoloring them would be great as well. So once I have one color done, I have a damp microfiber cloth off screen that I'm using to clean off that stamp before I go into the next one. And I'm trying to be a little bit heavier on one side of the balloon than the other so that we have a little bit of color variation. With our images done, I'm ready to start creating my second card. For the background for this card, I'm using the molded frame embossing folder. This I just think is a nice, simple but elegant background, perfect for framing in different things. So I thought it would be perfect for framing putting in one of our little statues. So I used some Oceanside cardstock. I wanted to have a nice contrast between that statue and the background for this card. So I centered that on the embossing folder, ran it through my machine on the 3D embossing folder, or the 3D embossing stacking for the machine. I have a piece of Hammermill cardstock that I trimmed down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. And my emboss piece there, I trimmed off 1/4 inch off of each side so that it ends up being 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. Now, once again, I didn't add any ink to it, but you could say use a gold pad and add a little bit metallic to show off that molded frame if you wanted to highlight it a bit more. For my mat, I'm using that tea dye ink and just ink blending around the outside so that my mat is going to perfectly blend in and coordinate with the statue that I'm putting on this card. I have an A2 card base here. I'm going to glue my mat down first. Then I'm going to glue down my embossed piece. Now, the embossed areas for this embossed piece is fairly simple. So it might look odd where I'm putting that glue, but I'm just putting it on the recessed areas, the areas that are going to have contact with the piece below. So I'm going to use the male figure for this one. I'm going to glue him down first. Then I'm going to add the stand for him, or the platform for him, as well as the balloons. I want to make sure that he's centered in the card and making sure that I have a little bit of a room underneath him for that stand. And then I'm just going to tuck those balloons behind him. Because there's a white halo behind it when you die cut it, I didn't want to have that covering him. So I just tucked it behind, and his hand is placed perfectly, so it looks fine if it's tucked behind there. Then I added the sentiment on the bottom, just kind of covering his legs. I thought his legs weren't the most important thing, so I didn't mind covering them a little bit. And then for a little bit of extra texture, I'm just putting some glossy accents on 3 of the balloons. I'm not doing it on all of them, just 3 of them, nice and separate so that the colors don't start to blend in together. I'll set that aside to dry while I'm creating my last card. So for the background for the last card, I'm using the Regal Lattice die. This is the Regal Lattice embossing folder. This is an embossing folder that has 2 different backgrounds on it. Each one of them is 5 1/2 by 4 1/4. So I put a piece of Alabaster cardstock in that background. The side that I'm using is the side that has like an arch with some florals on it. I thought that was a pretty elegant background that would frame the last figure nicely. So I'm trimming that down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. I'm using a piece of Fawn Cardstock for the mat for this, and I'm trimming that down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. Now, I didn't put any ink on this background, but I think it would be really pretty to have like a really light color, say that antique linen or the tea dye, just really lightly brushed on the risen or the raised surface to highlight some of that texture. I chose not to because I wanted to keep the focus on the main image, the figures as well as the sentiments, but that has such gorgeous texture to it with the florals on top of that arch. I think it's really, really pretty. So I put my figure down, and then I'm adding my sentiment here. Now, the sentiments in the Stampin' Cut say happy birthday, you're only as old as you feel, which is what I'm using for this card. The last card I did what said age is a state of mind, and then the first card I put you're a classic on that one with the die cuts, and I thought they worked really well. Look at that gorgeous texture in the background, and I think even just plain, it still adds some extra interest to these cards because the images are fairly simple, and I don't want to take too much attention away from them. So I thought having embossed backgrounds for that extra texture, but keeping them pretty simple, was the perfect background for these pieces. Then we have our little male figure on the dark background, and then we have our very first one with those die cuts on that damask background. Again, super simple, but perfect for elegant birthday cards. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.